This is what would be. I, I'll tell y'all a little bit. So some of this will be a review. I'm gonna bring this brother in one more time, right? And it's because this is part of what I was gonna be sharing with the revolutionary knowledge that the young brothers were gonna receive over the next couple of days. That is significant to us about Mexico. So part of the reason why my brother Anis moved here is because he and I were both from San Jose originally. So I'm from the east side. His family's from all over San Jose. His family is actually one of the first Black families that was in San Jose, like more than 100 years ago. And the neighborhood that I was raised up in was a Mexican neighborhood. And there was a whole bunch of Mexicans that have been there for generations. And so I was just really connected to Mexican folks, Mexican culture, Mexican people. I was learning Spanish because I heard it so much in the neighborhood that I was raised up in. And just throughout my upbringing, aside from these strong connections to the Black community and Black political, spiritual organizations that were part of my foundation, I was also connected to, like, the neighborhood where I'm from. It's a 10-minute walk from the childhood home where Cesar Chavez was raised when he was living in San Jose. And so Cesar Chavez's organization, the United Farm Workers, was heavy there. The Brown Berets, where they had a heavy presence in San Jose. So I was just really surrounded by it, and became comfortable and fluent in that cultural understanding. So it was never a challenge to see Latino folk, especially Mexican folk, Chicano folk, as potential allies in building and learning. And so having a place where if something goes wrong in the States for whatever reason, and we need to get out, we needed to build a home base that was close by that we can get to safely. And if water gets shut down, if food lines and lanes are also compromised, we got food. We can sustain ourselves. We got vegetables. We can sustain ourselves. We have water. We can do it. And we have the ability to protect ourselves in the event that something happens. So in front of us right here is part of why historically this territory, this land that we're on, which is now known as Mexico, is important to us within the Black experience. So those of you who remember when I talked about Gaspar Yanga in a couple of weeks ago, he was a brother who was forcibly enslaved, captured on the African continent violently and brutally, brought over here to the Western Hemisphere. This is in the 1500s, and resisted and rebelled his enslavement, not just individually, collectively, inspired other folks to also resist and rebel their enslavement. They escape and they engage in a campaign of righteous rebellion and self-defense for multiple decades against the Spanish imperialist colonizers. And their engagement is successful. They negotiate a treaty with the Spanish in order to secure their freedom for themselves, for everybody that's part of their community, or their progeny. So being here as Black folks, the very first person in the colonial imperial era that was able to liberate land and liberate Black folks successfully, the Black man here in Mexico by the name of Gaspar Yanga. So this is part of what we were going to be sharing with the brothers. So they all got a copy of the book, Carry On Tradition. So let me go ahead and just bring Gaspar's picture into here. So we're going to be talking about that and why being here in Mexico, giving folks opportunity to have an international experience. So they were coming from the DMV area. So the brothers from the East Coast were all coming from different parts of the, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And then we had our young brothers that were coming from the Bay Area with us, who had been a part of the program as well. And many of them, as I was saying, never been on a plane, never been to the West Coast, certainly never been to Mexico. So giving them an opportunity to be outside of that environment that they've been in for so long, to see things differently, and to be in a place where there's a revolutionary history of our people. Like this is important for all of us. In Mexico, when you say Gaspar Yanga, for those who are familiar with him, they'll say El Primer Libertador, the first liberator. That's what they call him. That's what he's known as within the context of Mexican history because he was the first person to liberate land on behalf of any folks impacted by imperialism and colonization in the Mexican context. The first from our tradition, you know what I'm saying? And did it in a dedicated, committed way. One of the things, this is a personal thing for the elders on the line right here. Like y'all inspire me so much because y'all made the decision to become a part of this tradition of Islam, maybe late 60s, early 70s, and y'all have been committed ever since. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not trying to romanticize that. I'm sure there may have been some crises of faith moments and all of that, but y'all have held the line. This brother fought for more than 3 decades with his companions. They held the line for a specific purpose. So whenever I see that historically, whenever I see that in a contemporary sense, it's something that really, really inspires me because how can you accomplish something if you're not dedicated and committed to it and not willing to stand up for it? So that tradition of being committed to an ideal and doing everything that you can in order to manifest it or embody it, I see that in y'all. And that's something that I'm being taught by y'all. It's something that I see in our history. And that's one of the lessons that we were going to be communicating to our young people throughout these next couple of days in the Black August Summer Institute, why we chose Mexico. So this is just more of Gaspar's story. And then we were going to get into some other Black history that's tied to Mexico. It's part of the reason why we're here. So another piece is when we get into the story of like Mexican independence. So Mexico fighting its independence war from Spain, and this begins in 1810. A number of the freedom fighters and the independence fighters were Black folks because Black folks had been here all the way back to the 1500s. We have that historical proof with Gaspar, and there was more than just Gaspar that was here. So when you get into the history of Mexico becoming independent from Spain and the people who are behind that revolutionary movement, you're going to find many indigenous people. You're going to find mestizo people who were mixed. You're going to find people who were Black, who were African. And one of the goals of Mexican independence was the abolition of the system of slavery. They were very clear in that. They wanted to return the land back to the people. They wanted to abolish the system of slavery that was here. And they fought and they were successful. In many of the early documents that you see that were part of the Mexican independence fighters, the rebels that were fighting against Spain, they talk specifically about abolishing slavery. They were successful. So they win their independence. The second president of Mexico, a man who was identified as Afro-Latino, indigenous, proud of his African ancestry, Vicente Guerrero. He was the second president of Mexico. He was the one who officially, through the new political machine that they created, abolished slavery. This is 1829, somewhere between 1829 and 1831. So Mexico had a Black president way before the United States had a Black president, and not that we see the position of president as something that is exceptional, because politics, we know that, right? But they had a Black president who had an agenda that was focused on, we need to do something that's going to make the condition of Black people better. That happened here. And that happened more than 3 decades before the United States brought the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And we know the 13th Amendment didn't end slavery because it still exists except as a punishment for a crime where the party should be duly convicted. Prison industrial complex, all of that. We know that. And who are the people who have been most affected by prison industrial complex? Our people. So it's still operating there in that country. Slavery's never been illegal at any point in time in the colonial history of the United States and the constitutional history of the United States. But Black people here in Mexico fought to end it, and then a Black president pinned it and added it to their constitution or added it to their political legacy and abolished slavery, which then influences U.S. history because Black people had already been escaping to Mexico for hundreds and hundreds of years. But especially after slavery was abolished in Mexico, more Black people started to escape to Mexico. And what territory used to belong to Mexico? Texas. So you had a lot of black folks in Texas in the 1840s. And then you had those colonial imperialists who then engage in a war with Mexico in order to steal that land back because they want to extend slavery into that territory that they falsely took or wrongly took from Mexico via war. So there's that history too. And then another piece of history that we're going to bring to their attention brings in the Cuban Revolution. So some of y'all are familiar with names like Fidel Castro. You might be familiar with Che Guevara. There were a number of other black revolutionaries that were part of the Cuban revolutionary movement before they launched the Cuban Revolution in 1959. They sought refuge. They had to escape Cuba. Che Guevara, he's not Cuban. He was from Argentina. He had made his way up South America and into the Caribbean, and then eventually into Central America. The Cuban folks who become the leaders of the revolution, they met, they planned, they organized, they committed themselves to their revolutionary ideals here in Mexico. And then left from Mexico to Cuba and launched what we now know as the Cuban Revolution. And they were successful. They were successful in kicking out the United States and reclaiming that land for Cuban people. And so there's a whole bunch of other examples, but I'm bringing this information to the young people. I wanted to give them a few examples where they could clearly see the involvement of Black people in this land, developing a tradition of liberation, of righteous rebellion, of freedom fighting that has changed the course of history. And it's a tradition that, like, wherever we go on this planet, there's going to be history that's tied to, if we want to just focus on ourselves as Black people or the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, there's going to be history that speaks to us directly. And then, of course, the larger way, and Imam Fahim has been talking about this in khutbahs over the past few weeks, like, we're mankind, we're insan. Like that's what we are. And so the tradition of our people everywhere, of mankind, that's also part of our tradition. But the specific community, because Allah has created us into tribes and nations, right? Or tribes and various communities. So there's something specific about being part of this particular iteration of who we are. So in that, our history is so powerful. Our tradition is so powerful. In general, our tradition is so powerful. But here in the Western Hemisphere, we can look everywhere and we can see the power of our people in fighting for what is right. And it's just so sad. And this isn't a commentary on what these brothers did last night. It's just so sad that when we're dependent on their systems of education, we're robbed of that. And some of that is because of us intentionally. Like, we should never be dependent on our colonizer or our oppressor for anything, especially knowledge and information about ourselves. And so, of course, they're not going to put that information out there for us to see. But everywhere on this map, our history is so powerful, especially here in the Western Hemisphere, in the era of colonization, imperialism, and forced enslavement. We've stood up. We've stood on business. We've handled our business. We've carried on tradition. And that was something that these brothers were going to learn. And inshallah, they'll resolve the issue. And those who are responsible for the wrong that they committed against our community here, we'll deal with them. They'll learn a lesson from that. Those who weren't responsible for it, they'll also learn a lesson from it. And then we'll get on with what we need to do in the learning and the work that we need to do here. But yeah, since we're here in Mexico right now, it makes sense to speak about Gaspar and also to add those other elements to it. Because our people, our history is so powerful. So I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to fall back.